It's roughly 60,000 years ago. You're a human. You wake up before the sun does, because something in your body still does that. Still pulls you out of sleep at the first gray hint of dawn, the way it has every morning for as long as you can remember. Your knees ache. They've ached for about 3 years now. Your back has a specific, personal kind of pain that lives just to the left of your spine and flares up when the weather changes, which, out here, is constantly. You can't run the way you used to. You know this because you've tried, recently, and the younger ones lapped you without seeming to notice. You have maybe 30 teeth left. The ones that remain work fine, mostly. You are, by the standards of your time and place, extremely old. You are, perhaps, 42. And here's what nobody ever really asks. What happens to you now? Not in the dramatic sense. Not, did ancient humans just abandon old people to die? Though that's a version of the question floating around out there. The real question is subtler and stranger than that. It's about what old even meant when there were no retirement homes, no pensions, no social security, no greeting cards with little cartoon cakes on them. It's about whether your community kept you, needed you, loved you, or quietly subtracted you from the equation when you stopped being able to outrun things. The short answer is, they kept you. The long answer is what this video is about, and it's considerably more interesting than you'd expect. Because the story of how ancient humans treated their elderly is not a story about survival of the fittest. It's a story about why survival of the fittest is, in a very specific and important sense, the wrong frame entirely. First, let's deal with the age thing, because it's more complicated than the memes suggest. You've probably seen it. Ancient humans only lived to 35, usually deployed to dismiss something about modern life. And it's technically rooted in a real number. Paleoanthropologists, who study skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer populations, do find average life expectancy figures hovering in that range. But here's what that number actually means. It's a mathematical average that is absolutely demolished by childhood mortality. When a significant percentage of your population dies before age 5, from infection, from accident, from the brutal randomness of pre-antibiotic existence, your average life expectancy collapses, even if the people who survive childhood go on to live long, full lives. It's the same reason you can't look at medieval European life expectancy statistics and conclude that nobody lived past 40. Plenty did. The average is just dragged down by the ones who didn't make it to their first decade. Researcher Rachel Caspari at Central Michigan University has done some of the most clarifying work on this. In a 2004 study analyzing thousands of fossilized teeth because they're the best age record we have in skeletal remains, she found something remarkable. In the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 30,000 to 10,000 years ago, the ratio of older adults to younger adults in the population suddenly surged. Not a little, significantly. She called it the grandmother effect, and we'll come back to why. The point is, old people existed. Old people were not a rare anomaly. Old people were a recurring, expected feature of human communities going back tens of thousands of years, and possibly much further. And because they existed, there had to be a social logic for what to do with them. What that logic looked like is where things get genuinely fascinating. In 1957, archaeologist Ralph Selecki began excavating a cave in the Zagros Mountains of what is now northern Iraq. The cave is called Shanidar. Inside it, he found the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals, not modern humans, but our closest evolutionary cousins, the people we shared the planet with, and, eventually, interbred with before they vanished around 40,000 years ago. One of those individuals has become one of the most discussed skeletons in all of paleoanthropology. Designated Shanidar 1, this was an adult male, probably between 40 and 50 years old at death, which for a Neanderthal represents genuine old age. Here's what his bones showed. He had a withered and partially amputated right arm. The bone had fused in a way that suggested the arm had been useless for most of his adult life. He had severe arthritis in his right leg and foot. He had damage to his skull that may have caused partial blindness or hearing loss on one side. He had healed injuries across his body that suggested a life of hard physical trauma. None of these conditions would have been survivable alone. That's not a small thing. That is one of the most important sentences in this entire video. A one-armed, partially blind, arthritic Neanderthal in a pre-agricultural landscape does not survive by himself. He can't hunt. He almost certainly couldn't have kept pace with a moving group without support. For him to have lived to 40 plus, in that condition, someone, some group of someones, had to have been deliberately keeping him alive. Feeding him, probably carrying things for him, protecting him during travel. They weren't primitive, they were caring. Now here's where it gets genuinely controversial, because Shanidar 1 is actually the second most famous thing about Shanidar Cave. The most famous is what Selecki found around several of the other remains. Dense concentrations of pollen, enormous quantities of it, clustered in a way that, to Selecki, looked like someone had laid flowers, many flowers, over the bodies of the dead. He wrote about it. The world loved it. The idea of Neanderthals burying their dead with flowers was irresistible. It meant ritual. It meant grief. It meant they understood that death was a thing that deserved to be marked. The interpretation has since been challenged. Researchers in the 1990s and 2000s pointed out that the pollen concentrations could have been deposited by burrowing rodents, which are extremely good at moving organic material around underground. The debate is genuinely unresolved. Scientists are still arguing about it. But here's what that debate cannot touch. Shanidar 1 still exists. The bones still exist. The body of evidence from that single individual, that someone was kept alive, maintained, cared for across years of serious disability, that part isn't theoretical. That part is real. Whether or not there were flowers, there was care. So communities kept their elderly. But evolutionary biology has a cold-blooded accounting system, and in that system, keeping an individual who can no longer reproduce or hunt is a resource cost. It costs food, it costs protection, it costs the bandwidth of other group members. For that cost to make sense in strict evolutionary terms, the elderly had to be providing something in return, and they were, dramatically so. The most powerful version of this argument is called the grandmother hypothesis, first formally articulated by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah in the 1990s. Hawkes was studying the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer populations on Earth, and one of the most studied, and she kept noticing something that didn't fit the standard model. The women who were most responsible for keeping children fed weren't the mothers. They were the grandmothers. Post-reproductive women, women who had stopped having children of their own, were spending enormous amounts of time and energy foraging for food and bringing it back for their daughters' children. The grandchildren of active grandmothers were measurably better nourished, grew faster, and had higher survival rates than those without involved grandmothers. The grandmother wasn't a drain on the group. The grandmother was an engine of the group's survival. Think about what that means in evolutionary terms. A woman who lives long past her own reproductive window, which is a genuinely unusual trait among primates, by the way, because most female animals remain fertile until very close to death, is actually increasing her genetic legacy more efficiently through grandchildren than she could by continuing to have her own babies in middle age. Human menopause, that strange evolutionary puzzle people have theorized about for decades, might be at least partially explained by this. It's more genetically efficient to stop competing with your own daughters for reproductive energy and pour that energy into grandchildren instead. That is not a consolation prize for getting old. That is an optimized survival strategy. The knowledge problem. But grandmothers providing childcare and foraging is only one piece of the picture. The other piece is arguably even more important, and it gets less attention. Old people remembered things. This sounds obvious until you actually sit with what remembering things meant in a world without writing, without recorded data, without any external storage of information whatsoever. Every piece of knowledge that a community possessed about plants, about animals, about seasonal patterns, about water sources, about which berries were fine and which ones would kill you in 4 hours, lived inside human brains. That was the library. That was the entire archive. Now think about what happens to a community when a drought hits that no living person has ever seen before, or a disease that arrives in a form nobody recognizes, or a migration of animals that hasn't happened within the memory of anyone under 40. The oldest person in the group is the one who remembers. Anthropologist Kim Sterelny has written about what he calls apprenticeship in early human communities, the systematic transmission of ecological knowledge from older to younger members. This wasn't passive, it was active, deliberate, crucial. Old people were the ones who knew where the water was 3 days' walk east, when the rains had been bad before. They knew which animals behaved strangely before an earthquake. They knew the full seasonal cycle of every edible plant within the group's territory, including the ones that only fruited every few years. In the Kalahari Desert, among the San people, elder hunters are still known for something specific. They remember the location of water sources that might be used only once every decade, in extreme drought. Young hunters don't have that memory because they haven't lived through enough droughts. But when the crisis comes, the elder knows, and the group drinks. You were not just keeping an old person alive, you were keeping a database alive. Okay, now for the part of the video where we stop being romantic about it for a minute. Because the evidence for elder care in ancient communities is real and compelling, but so is the evidence for its opposite, and a complete picture requires both. In some documented hunter-gatherer societies, particularly those operating under extreme environmental stress, Arctic peoples during food collapse, desert populations during severe drought, elders were, under specific catastrophic circumstances, left behind, sometimes at their own request. Sometimes not. The archaeological and ethnographic record contains accounts of elderly individuals being abandoned when a group was forced into rapid movement that they couldn't sustain. Some of those accounts include elderly people volunteering to stay, insisting on it, understanding the calculus. One study of traditional Inuit practices found that in periods of near starvation, an elder might choose to walk out into the cold rather than be a subtraction. This is not a comfortable thing to say out loud. It is also, when you sit with it honestly, a profound act, not of abandonment, but of self-sacrifice, of love in its most extreme expression. The picture that emerges is not ancient humans were uniformly kind to the elderly, nor ancient humans discarded the old without sentiment. It is something more human than either of those. They kept their elderly when they could, and they revered them while they were there, and sometimes, in the worst circumstances, they faced impossible choices and made them. That is not a caveman story. That is a very human story. Here's one more piece of the puzzle that tends to get left out of these conversations. Old humans weren't just passive beneficiaries of their community's goodwill. In some contexts, they were actively, specifically dangerous in a way that younger members weren't. Not physically dangerous, socially dangerous, strategically dangerous. Think about what accumulated experience looks like from a predator's perspective. A young hunter is fast, strong, energetic, and predictable. They react to stimuli quickly, they charge, they pursue. They're improvising constantly because they haven't seen enough situations to have pattern match to them. An old hunter knows how every large predator in their territory behaves. They've tracked lions, or bears, or whatever apex predator shares their ecosystem for decades. They know the tells. They know the false charges from the real ones. They know where an animal will run when scared, and which direction it will turn, and how long it can sustain a sprint. A 50-year-old hunter who can no longer run may still be the most dangerous person in a hunting party because they're the one making the decisions about positioning, about timing, about when to hold still and when to scatter. There's a reason the most experienced member of a group gets a title: chief, elder, shaman, whatever the local word is. It's not purely ceremonial. It is a survival-optimized social structure. Put the knowledge at the top. Let it direct the strength. Don't just keep the old ones. Listen to them. The fossil record has one more quiet revelation to offer. Isotope analysis of ancient human teeth, specifically the ratio of certain strontium isotopes in dental enamel, which changes based on the geological region where a person grows up, can now tell researchers where an individual spent their childhood versus their adulthood. And what these analyses have started to show, in sites across Paleolithic Europe and Africa, is something touching in its ordinariness. Old individuals, in many sites, didn't travel far from where they were born. They were, in a sense, the fixed points of their communities. The young dispersed, to find mates, to explore, to trade and raid and migrate. But the elders stayed near familiar ground, near the water source they'd drunk from for 40 years. Near the cave or the valley or the riverbank, they knew better than anyone. The group moved around them. The group came back to them. There's something almost impossible not to feel about that image. The young going out and out and out, further and further, and always eventually returning to the oldest person they knew, at the center of the territory, who remembered where the good berries came from before the fire, and what the river looked like the year the rains didn't stop, and how to make the particular knot that held the shelter frame together in high wind. Every single time, they came home. Zoom out far enough, and here's what you're actually looking at. Oldness, in the deep human story, was never the liability we sometimes imagine it to be. It was a feature. It was, arguably, one of the key differentiating features between our lineage and the ones that didn't make it. The Neanderthals cared for their disabled. The evidence is in the bones. The Hadza grandmothers fed their grandchildren through the lean season. The San elders remembered the water that hadn't been needed in 11 years. The old hunter positioned the young ones correctly before the charge. All of it together forms a picture of a species that figured out, very early and without language to articulate it, that accumulated time has value. That the person who has been here the longest has something to offer that no amount of speed or strength can replace. Rachel Caspari's study, the one that tracked the surge in older adults during the Upper Paleolithic, made a specific argument about timing. The explosion of cultural complexity we associate with modern human behavior, advanced tools, art, language-based trade networks, symbolic thinking, coincided with the period in which more humans started regularly living past 40. Her argument: you can't transmit complex culture without people who have lived long enough to carry it. The grandparents aren't just surviving, they're the mechanism by which civilization becomes possible. Let that sit with you. Come back to that 60,000-year-ago morning for a second. You, with your aching knees and your 30 remaining teeth and your personal weather predictor of a lower back. You can't run. You can't carry as much as you used to. You sleep less deeply and wake earlier, and your eyes need a little more light to read the horizon. But around the fire last night, you were the one who remembered. You were the one who told the younger ones about the time the herd moved early, because the rain came late, and where they went when it did. You were the one who showed the children which roots tasted bitter but were safe, and which ones tasted fine and were not. You were the one who held the territory in your head, the whole map of it, because you'd been walking it for 4 decades. You are not a burden. You are the memory of the group made flesh. You are the reason they know what they know. You are, in a very real and specific sense, the reason some of them are alive at all. So here's your question for the comments, and I want you to actually think about this one. If you could go back to that fire, to that version of being old, where your value was entirely in what you'd lived through and what you remembered, would you trade it for the version we have now? The pensions and the retirement villages and the very nice greeting cards? Or is something getting lost in the translation? Tell me down there. I'll read all of them.